Haichu. You ever had one of these before? All right, so if you've been watching the channel and you've been following along in this educational series, you know that I've been talking about a lot of different kind of stuff, not the traditional type of like, I'm going to teach a technique like the third shot drop or how to hit a forehand drive. I talk a little bit about the mental side, but a lot of this stuff is actually rooted in the ecological approach. And I'm not kidding when I say I don't do any static drilling anymore, and there's two reasons why. This is one of them, and my coach Greg, my grappling coach over at Standard Jiu-Jitsu over in Maryland, is the second reason why. Rob Gray, the author of this book, and my coach Greg are the reasons why I don't do any rote repetition, static drilling, or any isolated movements out of context anymore. No one else is really talking about this, and I don't really blame them. Despite the sport being around since 1965, it is still relatively new in terms of its like infrastructure and development, right? We see a lot of development in the equipment, the rules, the tournaments, the learning, but I think some of that coaching side is still in its infancy stages. However, what I am about to talk about has been around. It's been around for a while now, and it's been adopted in many different sports and different applications outside of sports, mainly anything that is based on motor learning. While you watch this, all I ask is that you keep an open mind, and as with anything, challenge what is being said. So I want to start this off by giving credit to two individuals, Rob Gray and Greg Souders. Greg led me to Rob, and Rob is the academic, the man who I feel has modernized the research and approach, helping us to not only understand it, but apply it as well. You can find out more information about Rob in the show notes and description. If you've been watching the channel, you know Greg is my grappling coach and the coach for Standard Jiu-Jitsu, and someone who has been learning, applying, teaching, and evolving this method for years now. Greg is a coach who has garnered quite a lot of buzz for applying this approach and developing it in the sport of grappling. So what we're going to go over in this video is the traditional approach, the ecological approach, what practice can look like, a little bit about the history, and some final thoughts. So if we look at the traditional approach, what I'm referring to is the rote repetition, memorization, the isolated drilling, the decoupled drilling, someone teaching you movements out of context, someone teaching you how it works for them, which their body, their past history, their experience, their movements, all of which is different from our own. So in the traditional view, skill is viewed as mental storage. They see skill as something that's stored knowledge and patterns in the brain, particularly the frontal cortex. And they believe that repetition strengthens these patterns, making them automatic and efficient. They also focus on internal processes. Learning is more about acquiring and internalizing rules, procedures, and representations of the skill. And then instruction focuses on breaking down the skill into components, practicing them individually, and then recombining them. And they look at the environment as if it's secondary. The information provides input and context, but the skill itself resides within the individual. So the traditional view sees skill as some internal mental representation. And the premise of this video, the ecological approach, sees skill as a dynamic interaction. Skill is seen as an emergent property of the dynamic interaction between the performer and the environment. The environment offers affordances, which are possibilities for action that are perceived and acted upon. The focus is on perception and action. Learning is about developing the ability to perceive and exploit affordances in the environment. And instruction in the ecological approach emphasizes exploration, variability, and adaptation to changing conditions. They also believe in the performer-environment symmetry. So the performer and the environment are considered equally important elements in the skill acquisition process. Skill is not something possessed by the individual, but rather emerges from the ongoing interactions between the both. So there's this great little excerpt in this website called sportsmith.co, and he says, the greatest impact this approach can have for an athlete lies in not telling learners which decisions to make and how to play the game or perform an action. Traditional practice assumes a need for long-winded, detailed explanations about how to perform an action or what decision to make. Coaches should be aware that instruction itself is a constraint that interacts with the task and the individual to shape behavior during each phase. Something about the individual approach is that it doesn't take into account that every individual is different. Each individual has different inherent constraints, like their body, their past history with sports or movements in general. Coaches will try to take these individuals and try to change them based on an ideal solution, like the ideal technique, right? But if we're looking at pickleball, how similar is Riley Newman's technique or skill to Ben John's? We know that there can be variation in their skill because there are invariant properties. And invariant properties are properties that do not change based on the conditions. They remain stable. To a degree, we should actually be celebrating the individuality, exploring it, not trying to quiet it. So given each individual is different, this is where constraints come into place. And constraints can act like guardrails or guides for the individual. They can focus and narrow the attention of the individual to information in the environment that is more suited to them or the task. All right, so this is the fun part. What is the ecological approach? Really quickly, I want to take a moment to thank my sponsor and also give you an exclusive discount for supporting this channel. So Storyi is a clothing brand that specializes in athletic and performance wear for both men and women. If you haven't heard about Storyi yet or tried it, ask a friend. Chances are they have or they know someone who has. I've seen it quite a bit, not only on the courts, but just walking around here in Austin. You can usually recognize Storyi on any of the shorts because it is that circular logo with a V on it. So if you want to get that discount, go to storyi.com/buildingpickleball. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but also free shipping on any orders of $75 or more, as well as free returns. So the ecological approach, this is the idea that skill is developed based on the information an individual receives between them, the environment, and the task. This is unlike the traditional approach, which is isolated drilling or teaching one ideal technique through rote repetition. The ecological approach is also an approach to skill development that emphasizes the relationship between the performer and the environment. It's the belief that the skill lies in the task and specific goals assigned to the performer in a particular environment, unlike the traditional model that believes skill lives in an individual. The ecological approach differs because it uses games and context-based practice to develop skill. I look at the ecological approach as a push towards individuals discovering and expressing their individuality through problem solving and tasks. A really succinct reminder and summary of this is that it starts with a problem first rather than the tools first. When you start with a problem, you then seek the tools to apply it in the appropriate context. Starting with a problem allows you to see what's around you and for you to seek to understand the environment. One of the key notable like founding fathers, if you will, Nikolai Bernstein, who I've mentioned in a previous video, has talked about this in the past. He mentions that movement organization is function specific, not muscle specific. And in other words, it's the task that builds the action and not the other way around. So when we look at the skill development and how to approach it, we basically look at these moments that are happening within a game, typically presented as problems, and then turn that into small-sided games during practice. Something that I've always remembered that Greg has talked about in the past is that the ecological approach places the emphasis on the why rather than the how. So I really like this part from this article called An Ecological Dynamics Approach to Motor Learning. The first step in changing thinking about the relationship between learning in practice and performance environments is to reframe skill as a process, not an outcome, that is concerned with continually improving the fit between an individual and the environment in the pursuit of a goal-directed action. That came from James Gibson, who was, again, a key individual in how the ecological approach was discovered and developed during that time. This was back in 1979. So when I think about the ecological approach, I can't help but think about how much of it is centered around just this idea of presence. And I don't mean to get all woo-woo about this. I promise this is gonna make sense. So when I have these calls with Greg to pick his brain on this stuff, one of the eye-opening realizations I had was one, how similar this is to our everyday lives and just reality. And two, the importance of presence. This approach isn't just about playing and trying to recall the specific movement just for the sake of doing it, or trying to recall this like movement pattern that you may have picked up through like instructions or maybe through drilling. It's more about what is the environment telling us at that given moment. What information is being provided? What are we perceiving that guides our actions? And we have to be incredibly attuned to our environment. And I think the ecological approach is analogous to life. I think most people nowadays would agree that life is not about conforming to some ideal solution. It's about actually being incredibly contextual. Like, it involves adapting to constraints that you face. It involves being present in the moment and seeing what's around you, to connect with the environment and understand it deeper, to understand how we want to go about our day, intention, and what we actively choose to focus our attention on. We love the idea of finding things out for ourselves, making our own discoveries. Of course, we'll learn from the mistakes of others, but when we imitate, we have to be the ones to explore it and put our own spin on it, adjusting it based on our own personal attributes, whether that's limitations or opportunities based on our unique selves. And in sports, we need to let performers explore, try things out. The ecological approach isn't something incredibly new, right? It's being applied in different sports, not just grappling, but it's of course being applied in like baseball, volleyball, basketball, soccer. I think what a lot of coaches are realizing, not calling myself a coach, but something I realize as well, is that the majority of educational content or teaching robs you of this experience of learning. Right off the bat, people will tell you exactly how to do something and just repeat it. And while you're going through this rote repetition, they're overwhelming you with all this critique and guidance and overwhelming detail, not allowing you to explore the problem for yourself. The ecological approach actually encourages you to find it on your own, explore the environment that is provided, and an environment that allows you to explore many different possibilities. This isn't to say that in an ecological setting that a coach isn't involved. They're very involved, but rather than explicit instruction or overcorrecting an individual, they use external focus of attention cues, and they use constraints. Rob Gray has mentioned this in the past before, that coaches in the ecological approach are more like designers rather than instructors. They're very heavily involved in the way practice is designed, and that's going to look different for every individual as well. These coaches and guides, they guide the individual. They manipulate the environment to help guide you to finding the solution for yourself, with an emphasis on being an adaptable problem solver. What should I be looking for? What is providing context for this action? Why am I doing this? But what they aren't doing is they aren't telling you how to do it. There's no doubt in my mind that you've seen this or experienced this for yourself, that there's someone telling you how to perform a particular technique and then just telling you to repeat it. And while you're repeating it, they're just correcting you through it. Not only that, but the context is missing. They might just be feeding you a ball and they're just telling you how to execute this. But in the ecological approach, it's less of a directive and more of coaches encouraging learners to discover for themselves. Performer works with the learner to guide their attention towards critical features of the environment to inform perceptual exploration and action. This reminds me so much of that quote, "The best teachers are those who show you where to look, but don't tell you what to see." I believe this is rooted in encouraging curiosity, critical thinking, and decision making, to encourage individuals to explore. The meaning of individual is single, separate. We have our own independent ways of seeing things, and we have our own limitations and capabilities as well. Someone else had posted this really good line as well. It says, "The motor system responds in real time to the environment rather than following a previously simulated prediction." So while reading the book and listening to Rob Gray's podcast, he's talked about this in the past. In the short term, the traditional method will look great. They'll get faster results. They'll do great. The ecological approach will take time. They'll struggle. It's a long game. But research has shown in the long run, the group allowed to explore and be adaptable will attain it better and transfer better to other conditions. This goes back to what I mentioned before about just being that adaptable problem solver. Rob Gray talks about it all the time. It's just this key principle of the ecological approach. And this goes back to what I was talking about before of, you want to encourage curiosity, critical thinking, and decision making. You want these individuals to be problem solvers, not just these robots that are repeating these movements without the context or the knowledge of what to look for. So regarding individuals in the ecological approach who will attain it better and transfer better to other conditions, what can we attribute this to? One, a richer learning environment. An environment that encourages exploration often provides a wider range of stimuli and challenges compared to a restrictive one. Two, an active engagement. So exploration encourages individuals to actively seek out information, experiment with different approaches, and make their own decisions. Three, feedback and error correction. In an open environment, individuals receive immediate feedback on their actions through their interactions with the environment. And individual differences. Recognizing that individuals learn in different ways, an ecological approach allows for varied learning styles and paces. So what we're going to look at now is what could practice look like? I think there's 3 key points. It's one, we want live effort and representative design, which I will go over. The difference between drilling versus games and examples of games. So remember what I said earlier about how it is the task that builds the action and not the other way around. So why games or drilling/games? Because drills typically aren't a live or real look. It looks like a warm-up. That's another thing I'm going to get into is my warm-ups no longer look like, hey, we're going to hit a couple of dinks cooperatively here. Then we're going to progress by me going to the non-volley zone. And then we're going to progress by me going to the baseline. Then I'm going to do some ladder drill warm-up. And then I'll hit a couple serves, basic serves. Yeah, that's no longer a sufficient warm-up. I think that's a very antiquated way of warming up. If you want to loosen your muscles, go ahead and do dynamic stretches, but I think this idea of hitting soft shots to each other is a very bad look. I think it's an inadequate warm-up. What we want is we want to see and feel the ball as it is when we play. We want to replicate the effort of a game. I don't do static drilling. Everything I now do is a small-sided live game. So there are some key things to keep in mind about practice. I've mentioned these terms before, but I'm going to mention them again and actually go into them in greater detail. So one is the affordances. Affordances is a common term in the ecological approach. It is the opportunities for action. Affordances, let's see. I don't have a mug here, but when you actually have a chair, the seat of a chair affords us this platform here, affords us sitting. Handle of a hammer affords us the grip. I don't have a coffee mug, but what I was going to say is the handle on a coffee mug, it affords us the opportunity for action of holding the mug. Affordances are everywhere. And then there are constraints, a term I mentioned before. So constraints are factors that limit, contain, or help shape the development of movement. Constraints can be manipulated within the task, the individual, or the environment. Think of this like triangle: environment, task, individual. An example of a task constraint would be a change in the scoring. Like you could say for a game, the resetting player receives 2 points for winning the point. That's like the player that starts at the baseline in the non-dominant position. An environmental constraint could be a change in the court, like indoors versus outdoors. Wind conditions could be the ball. An individual constraint can be constraining which hand they use, like non-dominant or dominant. And variability is another key term. So that is just varying the practice conditions. Going back to that concept of the adaptable problem solver, we want to introduce variability. The degree to which you introduce variability, of course, comes back to context. Like, context is everything. It really depends on the individual. It's relative. But for example, you want to vary your target. You want to vary your equipment. You want to vary your position. The goal, again, is to create adaptable problem solvers. And what that means is that's the ability to adapt to a constantly changing environment. Now, there are a lot of different ways to approach practice. A common method I see being used right now is situational games, where in pickleball, you might have a player start from the baseline and work their way up to the kitchen, just playing the point out. This game is fine. It's a very common situation in our sport. The way this differs is that there is no constraint really. I guess you could say there is like a positional constraint, nothing really like narrowing our focus or attention. Now, before we try to apply a different lens, let's clearly define what we want the task, end objective, and target to be for the performer. So maybe we want someone to work on taking volleys out of the air and recognizing when to approach the kitchen. We'll use the same starting points, right? We'll have one person at the baseline, one person up at the kitchen, and we'll tell the performer they can only approach the kitchen once they've used a volley reset. That in itself is a constraint. Once they've reached the kitchen and have completed 2 successful dinks, we reset the game. The kitchen player is doing everything in their power to keep that player from obtaining that neutral position. You're probably thinking, well, that's not realistic. Like, I wouldn't just wait until I got a volley to reset. Sometimes in the ecological approach, especially if you're using this concept of like differential learning, not that this is it, but what you're looking at in this game design is that specific game. Sometimes the games don't necessarily align exactly with like that real life scenario, right? Another constraint would be you can only attack off the backhand and left hand. Of course, like depending on the individual, you would probably attack with more than that. But say we just want to develop that certain skill and we want this performer to start understanding, perceiving, and looking at like what pieces of information is telling me when to move up, what the ball might look like when I'm trying to reset. So again, the key is we're telling them what to do, but not how to do it. We also give them a clear objective to work towards and what winning looks like. The thing about this like resetting using a volley is like, say that this is something that this individual really wants to work on and improve. Maybe this player might use 2 hands to reset, maybe 1. They might slice it out of the air. They might step over to use their forehand, might use their backhand, use a firm grip, soft grip, punch forward. They might keep the paddle still. They might brush the ball. What we're allowing the individual to do here is we're allowing them to explore the problem space for themselves and explore a solution within the problem space that is tailored to them. And again, in these little games, individuals are going to make a lot of mistakes, right? That's okay. We want them to figure things out for themselves, to develop that decision making, that explore that curiosity, and we want them to develop that critical thinking. What we don't want is to just hand them the answer on a silver platter. Again, I'm not telling them how to do this. We want them to discover and make decisions for themselves. There's also research that supports the benefits of discovering solutions to problems through your own struggle versus being instructed or told a method. You want people to make both mistakes and discoveries, to focus on the body, the paddle, and the ball. If you also notice, this links back to my previous video about external focus of attention. We talk about focusing on that intended outcome or the effect of our movement. So my coach Greg released a video recently under his jiu-jitsu gym's channel called Standard Jiu-Jitsu. And what he did in this video is he looked at a bunch of different coaches who have adopted the ecological approach for their gym, and they've started designing practices, and he critiques their practices. And there are those like 3 key points in the video that Greg talks about. He talks about like a task, an end objective, and a target. And what I got out of the video was that Greg talks about how you need to have clearly defined objectives and tasks. You make it very clear what you want them to do, but not how to do it. You keep the language very simple. You give people a specific target, and you give them an end objective. So there's an excerpt here from one of the articles about practice and drills. When the goal of a practitioner is to build an internalized model of a movement in a motor program or schema to ensure automaticity and repetitive consistency and persistence in skill performance, learning is typically initially framed around technique drills that allow subcomponents of the task to be decomposed for practice, acquired separately before being put back together. Drills have come in for considerable criticism from those who advocate for more contextual practice. Examples given: advocates for games-based and constraints-led approaches. The problem is that drills decompose tasks and fail to provide the key information that is present in performance settings. The perceived value of decomposed drills is further brought into question when one considers another seminal insight of Bernstein, that movement organization is function specific, not muscle specific. And again, it is a task that builds the action, not the other way around. How do we learn best? We learn best through context. And as far as games and context goes, like task-based games help us narrow down our focus to moments within the bigger picture. So you might be wondering, like, when do we play the entire point out? The way I've seen Greg structure it and other coaches is that they'll take like specific moments within an entire game, break those down, focus on those, and then towards the end of practice, they'll like play the entire point out. That way you can apply what you're just playing games on. So another key foundation to practice design is the education of intention and attention. Coaches will set an intention, which is a goal, and call out attention, where to look. Different things here like invariants will be mentioned as well, and you'll seek things like affordances, those opportunities for action, as well as invariants. Again, invariants are those conditions that must be met in order to execute an action. These are things that never change. They ring true no matter the environment. I guess for an example for pickleball, an invariant as far as the environmental side is the court. The court never changes. The size of the court does not change. The lines of the court does not change. The dimensions don't change. The fact that we play with a ball does not change. You could say, like, during a task, the serve, return, and the third shot requirements do not change. Those are invariants as well. Like, the serve has to bounce once, the return has to bounce once, and the third shot, before hitting that third shot, the ball has to bounce once. So again, we have to focus our attention to prioritize the information we're receiving. The definition of focus itself is constraining and narrowing where our mental energy goes. So something foundational to the ecological approach and practice design is the concept of transfer of training. Does what we're training have near or far transfer to the live environment? Basically, is the movement similar to what is required in a live competition environment? And is the information representative? We want to make sure that the context is similar and that the affordances are similar. And this goes back to one of the main reasons I have an issue with ball machines, because the performer isn't picking up the same information that they would in the live environment. Those pre-contact cues, again, those are mentioned in the video. If the ecological approach is a dynamic, perpetual interaction between us and the environment, then what we want to do is continually seek to understand what that relationship is between our skills and the application in the environment. So after I upload this video, I'm sure I'll have a lot more questions about what practice can look like. I'm actually going to start focusing on that. I'm going to start releasing videos of practice design. And if you're interested in seeing more of those, subscribe so that YouTube knows to notify you when those videos do go up. Of course, I can't talk about this without talking about the people who are kind of like those like key individuals who developed this and who we should be giving credit to, and that's Bernstein and Gibson. There's a couple others. I haven't really learned about all of them, but so far from what I've read and picked up is Bernstein and Gibson. There's a lot of researchers in between back then and now, but let's focus on these two. So a lot of this is based on this neurophysiologist named Nikolai Bernstein, who was around from like 1896 to 1966. He's credited for the concept of repetition without repetition, degrees of freedom problem, and variability in motor skill learning. I've talked about this in the past, the repetition without repetition, basically repeating the same outcome but not by repeating the same movement, which is kind of the opposite of the traditional approach where they want you to try and repeat the same movement to get the repeated outcome. But what Nikolai Bernstein found in his research with blacksmiths, they were hitting the same target, but their movements were all different. So another great excerpt from this article is, instead, Bernstein favored an approach where learners should be challenged to repeat the process of solving the same performance problem through varying practice conditions, a process he described as repetition without repetition, as opposed to repetition after repetition. And then we'll move over to James Gibson. He was a highly influential psychologist who studied the field of visual perception. He challenged the view of perception as a mental reconstruction of the world based on sensory information, and instead proposed ecological psychology, which emphasizes the direct perception of information from the environment. Gibson stressed that this process is continually evolving as a cyclical relationship between perception and movement. The agent perceives what to do by direct perception achieved through specific parameters. This perception of what is possible is relative to individual abilities and is afforded by the environment. So just some final thoughts. By no means is this approach going to be easy, but you have to ask yourself while you're practicing, am I being productive or am I just being busy? Those are two completely different things. But if you want to explore, you want to take accountability for your development, and you're willing to put in the work, then try this approach. So take a moment to think about any questions you might have. And if you did have any questions while watching the video, go ahead and leave them in the comments section. That way, if there's anyone else out there who also had the same question, they can also see the answer. Feel free to DM me on Instagram. The handle is @BuildingPickleball. For more information about the ecological approach, go to Perception and Action Podcast. That's Rob Gray's podcast. You could also check out his YouTube channel as well, and check out his book as well, How We Learn to Move. And for the practical application and more information, check out my coach Greg's gym's YouTube channel, Standard Jiu-Jitsu, all of which will be linked in the description below. Remember, context is everything.